Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, watching on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Councilmember Kendra Brooks. Our own Lance Haver will provide an update on the proposed water rate hike. And Denise Clay Murray will give us her take on the State of the Union address. Lance, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. Feeling a little bit like Groundhog Day, talking about water rates again.
We've been having this conversation every year around this time, I think, and that's sort of just the way it's been. So tell us a little bit about. Oh, go ahead, Lance. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm waiting for Bill Murray to show up.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about where we are in this process right now, this time around.
So there's two things that are happening, and I'm going to launch the slideshow if I can. There we go. So there are three things going on simultaneously. The first thing I want to talk about is the Water Department has sent an official letter to President of the City Council announcing that the Water Department is going to be seeking not 1, but 2 years worth of rate increases, all combined for slightly more than 20%. Now, to refresh our viewers' memories, this is on top of last year's rate increase and the year before rate increase. And this is on top of all the federal money that flowed from COVID dollars and flowed from the state to help people who are struggling. So it's a proposed 20% year after year rate increase. And you can see the bills are becoming so large that for some people, they're almost the same as their electric bills. So the bill is going to go up to $83.92 by the end of the second rate increase. And the average electric bill is slightly more, about $96. But electricity, you can go ahead and lower your usage. But with water, it's really hard to cut back unless you have a leak. Water is something that you use based on the size of your family and based on your life. So electricity, a lot easier to turn off the lights. Remember to do all those things with water. Yes, you can fix leaks, but other than that, it becomes really difficult. I think Denise is ready to join us. Let me hold off and invite her to join us and say a quick hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Denise.
And thank you for joining us tonight here on Hall Monitor. I was listening actively to what you were saying, Lance, because the last time I lived in Philadelphia, one of the things that I ended up getting into it with my landlord about was my water bill, and this is something that everybody who rents in Philadelphia needs to know in case your landlord asks you to do this. Unless your name is on the house, they can't force you to put the water bill in your name.
That's right. The water bill, unlike other utilities, follows the property. Mm-hmm. So gas, electric, internet, cable television, phone, all follow the person. Water follows the property. Water is really a tax. So water and taxes follow the property. Mm-hmm. But as I said, so we're looking at 2 more years worth of water rate increases. And now the Water Department, of course, can't just say, well, we want more money. They have to have reasons why they're doing it. And what they're saying is their costs are going up. They don't have any choice. They feel bad about it. But in the filing, it doesn't really talk about what they did to try and keep rates down. All the cost savings, they don't talk about those programs. How they've worked with PGW to combine services, there's absolutely nothing of that. But what they want to say is, look, we have to pay more. We're going to have to pay more to borrow money. We're going to have to pay more in labor costs. We're going to have to pay more for supplies. And that's why we have to raise the rates by 20%. And I keep stressing the 20% because, as we see, there's absolutely no comparison to what their costs have done and the 20%. The labor, which is a very significant portion of the water bill, and there's no two ways around it. We need to pay people to maintain the pipes, to maintain the service, to process the water. We need to pay them well, because if it's not done well, if we get water that's not safe, we become ill. If the pipes aren't maintained well, they break on our blocks, they destroy our homes, they destroy our streets. So having professionals run the water department is really good for consumers. And we should be very happy when we have a professional staff, professional workers, professional people running the water system. But all that being said, this comes directly from District Council 33, which is the union that represents water workers, what the pay increase is going to be in year 2023, which is when the water department is saying they need a 20% increase. Labor gets 3.25% increase in 2023. Water department wants 20%. Workers get 3.25%. So that can't be the explanation for why a 20% increase is needed. Then, of course, there's always inflation, right? Everybody's favorite thing, right? We hear supply chain problems and inflation. That's why eggs are so expensive. That's why gas bills are so much. That's why we pay so much more for gas at the pump. But again, it turns out not to really be true. It is true that we're living through an inflationary period. But if you look at this chart, what you'll see is the inflation is nowhere near the 20% that the water department is asking for. It's somewhere around 8%. And I'm not going to say that's okay. I am going to say, yes, it's high. But an 8% increase in inflation is very different than a 20% over 2 years increase in water rates. So it really can't be inflation that's driving the rates up. Next thing they say is, well, they've got problems. It's an old system. They have to borrow money to replace the pipes, and they have to pay what they call debt service, which is really just a tricky way of saying they borrow money and they have to pay the bondholders more. And again, that's true. We need to borrow money because we don't want to charge anybody for 1 year worth of pipes all at once. The pipes have a lifetime of at least 50 years. So we spread that out, and we spread it out as equally as we can. What the water department isn't telling us is that they are getting low interest loans from the state of Pennsylvania. The program is called Penvest, and they are borrowing $240 million at an interest rate of 1.8%. Again, 1.8%, and the amortization table is a little tricky, but 1.8% versus a 20% water rate increase doesn't equal the same, doesn't make sense to say we need it. The water department also has a surplus. Now, they don't call it a surplus, they give it a fancy French name to kind of confuse it. They call it the Rate Stabilization Fund. This is created because when the water department borrows money from bondholders, the bondholders demand that the water department collect more than what they have to pay the bondholders, so the bondholders don't have to worry about not getting paid. It's called a coverage ratio. And so the water department agrees, yeah, we owe you $100 million. We'll collect $120 million and give you the $100 million. That $20 million will be a cushion. And that cushion goes into the Rate Stabilization Fund. In the filing, the water department will not say how much is in the Rate Stabilization Fund. The last time it was published in the city's 5-year fiscal plan, it was $250 million. I will say I don't know how much is in it today as I'm talking with you. It is fair to guess it is somewhere around 200 to 250 million. But until we get a chance to ask the water department directly, how much surplus do you have? How much cash do you have in a bank that doesn't have any retail branches in Philadelphia? And why can't you put that money in a credit union that helps local folks? But how much do you actually have? We don't know whether the number 250 or 150 or 300 is right, but it's somewhere around $250 million. And again, this is outright surplus. This is extra money that they don't need today, that they're just holding on to for some time in the future. On top of that, I think many of us saw in the newspapers, President Biden announced that the infrastructure bill that he passed is going to give the city of Philadelphia's water department $500 million. Now, the water department says, well, we knew about that in advance. So even though we're now getting $500 million, we still need a 20% rate increase because we were expecting to get the $500 million. That doesn't ring true to me, and let me show you why. Because when you read what the water department said, they said that they were expecting to get the $500 million from the Water Infrastructure and Innovation Act. That's the abbreviation is WIFIA. They're getting $340 million from that program. On top of that, every year for the next 5 years, they're getting $160 million from the state. So they're actually getting significantly more than the $500 million they were suggesting. And at least $160 million of that money is not tied to infrastructure. So it can be used in innovative ways to keep rates down. The water department hasn't told us that part. They said, well, they expected to get the $500 million, so therefore they need the 20% on top of the $500 million. And they're not telling us, well, yes, we're getting $340 million, which we expected, but on top of that, we're getting $150 million every year from the state for the next 5 years, which the water department was not expecting. That raises the problem of what is the water department actually doing? If you add it up and you take the total, the $340 million and the $160 million, you get the total of $143 million. That's the total that the water department is getting from the federal and state government. That is $16 million less than what they planned for. So they have all of this extra money that they didn't plan for coming in this year, next year, and for the next 5 years. The water department has no place in its filing where they say, yes, we expected this money and we counted on it. In fact, it's a huge windfall for them. And you would think that they would take this opportunity to say, well, now that we have this windfall, we're going to withdraw our request for a 20% rate increase, see what we can do to make it unnecessary, and see how we can help our consumers. That leads to the question of how are consumers going to be protected from these rate increases. Now, the good news is City Council is already playing a role. The water department is owned by the city of Philadelphia. I know there's some of our listeners and viewers who always raise the question out, wouldn't we be better off if we privatized it, if we sold it? The answer is unequivocally no. We know that because the water departments that have been sold in the suburbs have led to 150% rate increases. We know that if you sell the water department, a private owner is going to have to pay more in taxes, going to have to pay more to borrow because they won't get any of these low-cost loans, and is going to have to make a profit. So as inefficient as the water department is, a private company buying it will cost far more. And we know that not just on numbers, but because what we see happening around Philadelphia, where Aqua USA or other water departments buy up all the municipally owned water utilities or sewer utilities, no rate increase for 2 years because that's the promise, and then 150 to 200% rate increases after that. So we're faced with this dilemma. The water department, unless City Council forces them to withdraw the rate increase, and City Council has scheduled hearings, the Philadelphia Water Rate Board, which approved the rate increase, the last 2 rate increases, will be deciding on whether this increase should go through. Without so much as a request for proposals or a public hearing, the Water Rate Board has renewed the contract of the public advocate, quote unquote, public advocate, who agreed to the last 2 rate increases and is actually not having a client group. So the public advocate, even though the word public is in there, doesn't represent the public in any way. There's no client group. There's no client advisory group. When we questioned the Philadelphia Water Rate Board, how could the public advocate represent the public if they don't have a client group, if they don't have any clients? The answer was, well, they don't represent the public. They don't have a quote unquote client relationship with the public. They are hired by the Water Rate Board to be consultants for the Water Rate Board. Therefore, it's no surprise to me that the quote unquote public advocate doesn't serve the public. They don't have to. There's no client group. And even if they wanted to, how would one person know what 500,000 water consumers are thinking? How would that happen without trying to hear what people have to say? And unless there is some changes in how the public advocate acts, and that may come from City Council, Councilman Johnson, who's the chair of the Utilities and Transportation Committee, who's scheduled the hearings, he may insist that the public advocate represent the public. But unless that happens, I think we as water consumers have to know that we're at risk of seeing all this federal money kept privately, kept aside, and the water department saying, well, even though we have this huge amount of money, cash, $250 million, even though we have $500 million right now from federal state money, and even though we're getting $150 million this year and every year for the next 4 years from the state, we're still going to reach into the water consumers' pockets and raise rates by 20% because no other reason they can. And that's my report on the water rates. I will be in court tomorrow seeing about overturning the last rate increase, and I'll report back on that. But I'm fearful that unless the city council, especially Councilman Johnson, demand that the public advocate represent the public through a client committee, that we're going to be facing the same problems we faced in the last 2 rate increases.
Now, Lance, why isn't there a city-appointed public advocate to deal with this and other utility issues?
I can't answer that. At one point, that was my job for the city of Philadelphia.
Right.
I left, and we could talk about this for a long time, but I left a number of years ago because I didn't feel I was being allowed to as vigorously represent consumers' interests on old debt as what I thought was appropriate. And no mayor has seen fit to appoint somebody else to do it. And maybe that's one of the questions we could ask. There was even a charter change to appoint someone as the public advocate for Philadelphia consumers. People voted for it. I was very honored to be given that position. And when I left, I was never replaced. And as a result, we have the system we have now.
Now, is that still on the city charter? Can someone, say, hey, look, this is part of the city charter. This should be here. And this should be here, especially for occasions when the water rate board decides that despite getting millions of dollars from the federal government, they're going to jack up water rates.
The answer is yes, it could be. It's not. It's something that I hope we'll start addressing when we ask people, the mayoral candidates, what they plan to do to keep PGW and water rates affordable. It's been very difficult for consumers, for middle-class consumers who make too much to get any of the government programs, watch the PICO bills and the PGW bills and the water bills go up on average by 15%. Now, we know that some of that could have been helped, but we know some of that cannot be helped. And it's a very difficult struggle. One of the things that the water department failed to do was to use all the COVID dollars to help people who are struggling with their bills catch up. So every time we use a federal program to help someone pay their water bill, that means there's less of a demand on every other consumer. So the water department, even though they say they care, financially, they don't have an incentive to get everyone to sign up, because if they don't get people to sign up, they just file for another rate increase. For them, there's absolutely no accountability and no downside to running the program poorly. If they don't get enough people to sign up, there's no accountability for it. Nobody says, hey, wait a minute, you should have brought in 30 million. You only brought in 3 million. That 27 million is missing from the rate base. And see, these are difficult issues. I don't want to suggest this is a simple answer, but I do know that if we don't pay attention to it and our mayoral candidates don't recognize that as the water department that the water bill starts to compete with the electric bill, that we're going to have more and more people who work at CVS or work at a Rite Aid or work at a supermarket who make enough so that they don't qualify for the low-income plans, but don't really make enough to live a comfortable life, that we're squeezing them out. And when we talk about affordable housing, what we're really talking about is how much income does someone have left over to be able to pay for their housing. And if it all gets eaten up with utility bills and food, we can't be surprised that there isn't enough left for people to have a comfortable life. I think anyone who works 40 hours a week should make enough to be able to live comfortably. I mean, at least 2 bedrooms, maybe not a bedroom for every child, but at least 1 bedroom for the adult and 1 bedroom for the kids. Be able to go out at least twice a month, even if it's to McDonald's or Burger King's or Pizza Hut. Have at least 2 weeks off a year and be able to put food on the table every night and make sure that their health care is paid for and that they live a quality of life. We can't do that if all the money is going to pay utility bills And we can't be surprised when these bills go up. And as I said, labor is getting a 3.5% increase. The water bills are going up by 20%. That money has to come from somewhere. And unfortunately, it often comes out of people's ability to pay for housing.
That's right. Well, Lance, thank you so much for that
Yes,
report. And we're going to be following this for a while now until we get to a conclusion with this. Now we'd like to play an interview we did with Councilmember Kendra Brooks, talking about what her goals are for this spring council session. So here's Councilmember Kendra Brooks. All right, Councilmember Kendra Brooks, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So City Council's fall session is in swing now. What are some of your key goals for this session?
Well, for this session, we are going to finally get our rent control hearing, which is next week, Wednesday, February the 8th. And we're moving forward with the work we were doing on buying back the community gardens that were encumbered by the U.S. bank liens and return them to local control. We're also focusing on connecting constituents to summer youth opportunities, with camp, summer job employment, and making sure folks in the most impacted communities have access to those opportunities. And of course, our budget is coming, which will be, our main focus. And we're using a transformative justice lens to make deep neighborhood investments and create safe and healthy communities. So those are the priorities.
So let's talk a little bit more about that rent control, because this is, in just my opinion, this would be a seismic shift and something that is probably very needed in the city right now.
Absolutely.
How do you see that? How do you see that working?
Well, I think I'm being pushed to change the wording to rent stabilization, but whatever we're going to call it, it's going to be something that we need to do, because we see the rents have skyrocketed 7% on average this year. And we know people are getting cost out the city. So, we think that affordability is number one. We realize that rent stabilization is like an anti-gentrification, an anti-displacement measure. And there's a number of ways to do it. And we're looking to explore the best ways to do it for Philly. A lot of the pushback say, other places didn't do it well, but we're creating something that's just for Philly, because, we have to define what's right for us. One of the arguments we keep hearing is that it's going to affect the small property owners, but we want to ensure that we're going to make sure that it's a check and balance, just to make sure that everyone is getting a fair shake at this. We don't want to affect small landlords either. And we realize that once we, find ways to stabilize rent, especially in gentrifying neighborhoods, we'll be able to kind of, not just stabilize communities, but it'd be a huge break for community members. And, we had to create opportunities for affordable nonprofit developers, like by, reducing the real estate speculations and kind of controlling the market. And that's kind of what we're looking to see with this. We realize that, rent stabilization is an anti-violence measure, is an anti-homelessness tool. So there's so many different benefits from stabilizing rents. And we're going to do this rent control hearing to kind of get to the basis of what's best for our Philadelphia communities, and primarily those that have been most impacted by gentrification and displacement.
And it's one of those things, just like you mentioned, where when you look at gun violence and you take a step back, you're looking at poverty, and when you take a step back, the thing that feeds into poverty is homelessness. So it makes sense that now is the time to look at this. This was part of a package of legislation from, I believe, in June of 2020 as well. That, and I could be wrong on the date, but I think that's what it was. So this time you're going to have the hearing. What has changed between then and now to get to this point?
Well, we finally got our rent control hearing. The pandemic was in the way to prevent us from even getting the hearing and beginning the conversation. And, this was the first bill that I introduced, the first piece of legislation that I introduced the first day of council. So it was never off the table. It's just with the pandemic. And actually, we brought this up again during our renters access, no, wrong one, Emergency Housing Protection Act. Rent control was a part of the original package, but we couldn't get it out of committee. So it's just timing, and I don't want it to, we have to have the conversation now, even if we're not able to move the legislation in this, with this council body.
Okay. So let's shift the budget a little bit. Can you tell me a little more about the lens you just described and how you're looking at the budget?
So, you know, as being a restorative practitioner, you know, I believe that the only way we can move forward is to like really heal some of the harm that has been done. And we have to address some of the structural racism problems, whether it's with the housing system, with education, with gun violence, all of these things. We need to come together and figure out our budget proposal that's grounded in transformation. And we look over the years and we see how tax handouts have been given to the ultra rich. At the same time, underfunding city services. That's how we got to where we are, by disinvestment in neighborhoods, disinvestment in young people, disinvestment in schools. And I feel like if we look at those investments as a transformation for the city that we want, then we'll be able to, you know, cure, not even cure, but help with some of the root causes of the number one thing that comes on the list is violence, gun violence in our city. And I think we can address all of that if we just get to these root causes. And some of it is about relooking at our budget and transform the budget into something that affects all communities and stop working in silos. So part of our transformative budget is like, how can we all work collectively together to work on all the things that everyone is talking about? The number one thing when you talk to constituent is violence and housing. That I can't think of one council office that doesn't have a huge number of influx of calls around those two things, and education. So how can we do that together? So we're working on something. We've been working on it for the last couple of, since I've been in office, but we decided to pull it together as a clear format of what does it mean to have a transformative budget. And what does it mean to build a transformative city? So that should be coming out in March, I think is our launch date for this whole plan. And it slides right into the budget, and it also slides into a clear platform on what I see for Philadelphia over the next 4 years if I'm reelected.
Okay, so what you're going to be releasing is kind of like what your blueprint would be for the city budget? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, this sort of dovetails into my next question. You know, there's a budget surplus, and there are these federal funds that haven't been spent yet. Coming into this budget season, how would you like to see that money be used, if at all?
I mean, we have to use the budget around, we have to use that money around the issues that are most pressing. You know, we talked with the school district and make sure the money that was allotted to the school district is going to healthy, safe schools for young people. And that's a multiple thing, like mold, asbestos, lead, and children be able to breathe while they're in the building. But also, what does it mean to have a safety model in school that's just not over policing? You know, so we need to make sure that we have mental health supports. I think we looked at some statistics, and they said that the ratios for a child and a counselor in Philly, we're way beyond those ratios. I think it's like 50 to 100. And we're at like one counselor per school. They could have 300 children in communities that are highly affected by gun violence and poverty with huge amount of trauma. We can't expect young people to learn and thrive if we're not addressing their basic needs. And you can't move forward if mentally you're held down. And I think we need to make those investments. So when I think of what does it mean to have a safe school community, all those investments need to be made. And that's with the school district. But then on the flip side, on the city budget, we have infrastructure issues. We have parks that, you know, still need, you know, lighting, and pools aren't open. We don't have enough staffing at pools. They're not open on the weekends at parks and recreation centers, including libraries. All of these things work together, because if we look at the population of folks that are most impacted by this gun violence, it's a generation of young people that have received the most disinvestment in this city. So when schools started closing and programs started closing, if you count the years back, those are our 18 to 25-year-olds. So what are we going to do for the next generation? But also, what can we do to offer them second chances on opportunities to really, be productive citizens? And when I look about the city budget, it's more than just brick and mortar. It has to be about people. So part of this transformative budget, we're touching on all of these different areas to kind of bring it together, and where the funding is going to come from, whether it's some of the federal funding that individual city offices that will be receiving or waiting to receive or have received, as well as the surplus. We should have a huge amount of money coming in with this Super Bowl, and the fact that our teams are going to the playoff, that is generating revenue that we didn't have before through some of the taxes that are connected to, fun stuff like drinking and smoking. So I'm looking forward to, how this budget year kind of reflects how can we have a vision for the city just that's beyond 2024. We can't look at the future of the city in 3 and 4 year increments. We have to look, what do we expect 10 years down the line? And that's how this transformative budget that I'm talking about, and how we funnel the money that we have been bringing in, that we will be bringing in, into the city in a way that we can have the city of our dreams or close to it within the next 10 years. And if we don't do that, we're going to find ourselves having the same conversations over and over again. I've been fighting the school stuff around building improvements for 15 years. The same argument.
Yeah. All right, I'd like to bring in Denise Clay-Murray here on Philadelphia Homeline.
Hi, council member. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
You were talking a little bit about restorative justice framework for this budget, which in a lot of ways makes sense. But we're also, whether we want to talk about it or not, in the middle of a campaign season. And unfortunately, when people hear stuff like restorative justice at a time when we're also dealing with massive amounts of gun violence, that those two things don't match up all the time. So how do you communicate that to not only like residents, but people who are potential voters in a way that it explains not only that this is about correcting disinvestment, but also about getting the problem of gun violence under control?
I think and I don't think they conflict. I think it's that and. I think restoration means investments in the root causes of what's happening, but that does not take away that we need solid solutions about what's happening now. And if we're talking about crime, we have most crimes aren't reported. And, when people want to talk about policing, the police aren't solving the crimes. So that's a separate argument, but it has nothing to do with us creating a restorative model for restoring our city. I think that the siloed model that we have seen needs to end. I think we need to make investments in the things that work. Okay. That means, making sure we're doing prevention, also interruption and intervention. And then on the flip side,
on the air,
if someone commits a crime, it needs to be solved. We can't talk about, real reform or change if we aren't solving crimes. The crimes need to be solved. I'm not taking away from that. So restoration doesn't take away the fact that there needs to be, I hate to use punishment, but there needs to be some kind of outcome when someone creates a crime, whatever it is, whatever it's prison or whatever. But at this time, it's not happening. Nothing is happening. The majority of the shooters in the city are running free, and nothing is happening. And that's the doom and gloom conversation gets us nowhere. I think we have to have this collective conversation about what needs to happen, collectively, whether it's from, like I said, intervention, prevention, interruption, and also a solution, to help solve crimes. And I think it's not that or, it's both and. And that's how and the reason we're calling it a transformative plan and not a restorative plan, because I feel like restorative has been used so much, and I want to make sure that we're talking about a way to transform systems.
Okay.
Because we can't restore back to what we already had. We have to do better. So we're talking about a transformation of systems that have already been in place, and some of these systems that has systemically led to some of these problems. Like this disinvestments led to why we have this huge amount of young folks that are actively involved in, violent crimes. And that's why I thought it was important for us to look at it from a holistic approach. We can't just penalize young people when we disinvested in them in a long time. So we're okay with paying $40,000 a year to keep them locked up, but we only invest $14,000 a year in education per child. That's problematic. So I'm going to pay $40,000 for you to be in jail for the next 20 years, where I could have invested 12 years, 20,000, like 25,000. And on the outcome, we'll have a productive society. So when I think of transformation, I'm bringing in my work as being a parent advocate, a youth advocate, a gun violence interrupter, all of these things in the street now with my legislative experience. And how can we bring this all together in a way that makes sense? And we can't do it just government alone. There has to be government and community. And these investments have to be kind of linked together with government investments and community investments. And the community investments may be time, and energy that we have to encourage all people, young, old, or just neighbors, to come in together to do these things. And that's why, I just wanted to kind of push back. I don't think it's either or, it's both and. And I'm coming from that perspective because active community engagement is what led me into politics, not the other way around. And how can we duplicate, not just me, but so many other folks that are doing the work in the street, but it just goes unseen and unheard. And we need to find ways to kind of bring it all together to, transform our city into what we all would love to see, the city that we talk about,
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of politics, this is the end of your first term as a city council person. What have you learned through this experience coming from an activist perspective that you didn't know before?
The first lesson I learned was government moves slow, very slowly. A lot of things I expected to be moving much quicker than they have. I've been using the word frenemies more. Because like I said, I entered this world from a restorative lens, and I realized some people we don't agree on anything, and some people we agree on some things, but not everything. But we still are good allies, and we can work together on things to get to a solution. And I have shown that, whether it was paid sick leave legislation that we moved, whether it was some of this housing legislation, like how can we get to a win? And I think that was my biggest lesson learned coming from activism. It's like there are no forever enemies around here. Like sometimes I have to knock on the doors of folks that I don't agree with just to get to something that I really want and figure out what our mutual benefit is for us to win. And I think that's how we're going to move some of this rent stabilization. I have to talk to everyone. We have to talk to the landlords. And I think that was my biggest hurdle as an activist, because I come from protesting and shutting it down. And I think sometimes I can't shut it down. I have to engage in a way to move it forward, the best for my constituents.
Okay. Now, how will you manage to, because I understand you're running for re-election. How will you manage to do that and do what you need to do for your constituents? I mean, is this something that folks have been giving you any kind of advice on how to, get things done in an election year?
No, but I definitely feel the burn. I believe that, I have a strong team on both sides, whether it's my campaign team or my office team, and, everyone will do their part to move the legislation that we want to move, as well as for me to run a productive campaign, a productive winning campaign in this season. And I think it's possible. I'm expecting some bumps in the road, but that's par for the course. And no one has given me any advice about anything. It's kind of crash and burn around here.
Now, you came in, because I remember covering your campaign, and you came in with the, if we're going to have a minority party, why can't it be the Working Families Party? That was kind of, your thing. And there are other people from Working Families that are running, for the minority council seats. Are you encouraged by what you've seen as a council member about, in terms of them possibly, could you guys possibly become the minority this year?
Yes, I believe it's possible. I believe when I ran back in 2019, they said that was impossible, and it happened. I have a proven track record. I have shown that the Working Families Party or the Working Families Party line can deliver for working people in the city, multi-class, multi-racial communities. And I think that the city has recognized that as well. And I think we have an opportunity now to, take other seats that were reserved for a minority party. And why not Working Families Party? I think it's the perfect time. And I think we have a proven track record.
Okay. And one last question. The Working Families Party made an endorsement for mayor. It was Helen Ginn, which was not a surprise to any of us. But she's recently kind of hit a bump in the road herself in terms of showing up at an event at the Union League, which has kind of, made people start to question whether or not that's an endorsement you guys should continue to make. Have the Working Families Party thought about, what they're going to do with this, or are you kind of like, okay, we'll just work through it?
Well, I mean, in all, Helen has a 20-year track record for delivering for working families, and that speaks for itself. And that's what matters to me. That's what matters to our constituents. Our constituents want a Working Families Party. I mean, many candidates have a bump in the road. I mean, she has not been the only one, but Helen is the one that's most aligned with our working families values, that has been most consistent over the years since she's been elected and prior to election. She was the first endorsed Democrat through the Working Families Party in the state, in Philadelphia. And I think, incident happened. She attended an event. Yeah, she apologized for it. And I'm not saying it, I'm not trying to I can't get the word, minimize it. But the reality is, like, in the next 3 months, everyone else will be there too. In reality. And the Union League has been problematic before this DeSantis decision. And, I think, Helen critics, like, this is something that they could use to kind of minimize her. And, I do think it was a misstep in her campaign. It was definitely an oversight. She apologized. I've spoken to her about it. And her track record still aligns more with the Working Families Party. And that's why she was the person that got our endorsement out of all the candidates that interviewed. And our state committee has, still holds firm to that.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us, and we really appreciate it. And I'm going to give you back to Larry McGlynn, my co-host here on Hall Monitor, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
All right. Thank you, Denise. And Councilmember Brooks, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right. We'd like to thank Councilmember Kendra Brooks for joining us on Hall Monitor. And Denise, so last night was... I expect what happened at the State of the Union last night. So, what is your take on President Biden's State of the Union address that occurred last night?
Well, first of all, I owe the person known as your favorite trash man $10. And the reason why I owe him $10 is because ever since we had a congressman yell, "You lie," at President Obama in his first or second State of the Union, I have had a standing bet. And that bet is that somebody on the Republican side is going to do something obnoxious. They're going to either yell something at the president or they're going to make some sort of rude gesture. And last night, I doubled the bet, where if the person who did said dumb thing was Lauren Boebert, the representative from Colorado, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a representative from Georgia, or Matt Gaetz, the representative from Florida, you doubled your money, which meant you wouldn't have won $5 from me. You would have won $10. So your favorite trash man won $10 because not only did Lauren Boebert yell something out, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who looked more like she was going to a disco than the State of the Union, called President Biden a liar and yelled it out, and otherwise just, basically showed herself to be exactly what she was. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, on the one hand, you had to admire Joe Biden because he's basically painted the Republicans into a corner when it comes to Social Security and Medicaid. Since the lie that Marjorie Taylor Greene alleges that the president was telling was that the Republicans want to cut Social Security and Medicaid, when he said, "Oh, you don't want to do that? So you're not going to send something to my desk in which you do that." Good. We're on the same page.
And we need to talk about that for a second, because I think any threat to Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare is an abomination. Mm-hmm. It's something that people have paid into their whole lives. This program's existence since the 1930s. It's one of the most popular programs in the history of this country. There's a long time where Republicans wouldn't go near Social Security even though they hated it. Now with this extremism you're seeing on the right, you're starting to see more and more of that. And this has taken multiple different tacks. And I just want to explain just a little bit of what this is. The first is you have some members of the Republican Party saying, we want to make any legislation that we pass void after 5 years. So if it's a good program, you just vote on it again. Well, that's the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. Largely because you now make every government program, every piece of legislation you ever passed, subject to the whims of whatever political party is in power at that time. That's not how we designed the Constitution. That's not what this is about. And the reason why I equate that with Social Security is because that is exactly one of the things that would have to be renewed every 5 years, which makes no sense. Not to mention the fact that if you're going to do that every 5 years, you're going to choke Congress with every piece of legislation ever passed that has to come back on the House and Senate floor again. So that's one thing. The other thing we keep hearing under the guise of choice is let's let people invest their Social Security in the stock market. Let's create savings plans. Now, this is a terrible idea as well. George Bush wanted to do this during his term of office, George W. Bush, the second Bush. And if he had done that at the time he wanted to do it, Social Security would have lost half of its value, at least half, because the stock market went down, and that would have destroyed it. So again, another bad idea. And this is something that Mike Pence, former Vice President Mike Pence, is going around talking about now. And then you just have the people who want to just get rid of it. People like Mike Lee from Utah, the senator from Utah, who was caught on camera saying, we're going to get rid of Social Security. That is my top priority.
Then he turned around. Then, of course, he turned around and said, I didn't say that. There's video of you saying it.
Yeah, there's video. So the idea that Social Security is some kind of, and by the way, I just want to mention this as well. This is a key point when we talk about Social Security. The way Social Security is paid for is something called the payroll tax. Payroll tax is only assessed on the first $180,000 of income. So if you make $180,000 a year and somebody else makes $180 million a year, let's say 180 million versus 180,000, you pay the exact same rate in payroll tax, the exact same a dollar amount. If you took the cap off the payroll tax, the program would be solvent for forever. There wouldn't be a need to even talk about cutting Social Security, or the other backdoor way they're trying to eliminate your benefits by raising the age limit for Social Security to 70 years old. This is something Lindsey Graham is talking about. That would equate to an over 20% cut in your Social Security payout because you're taking longer to get to the retirement age. So all these different things that they're telling you are needed. We need entitlement reform. No, you don't. No, you don't. You need a slight revision of the tax reform. That's all you need. Take the cap off the payroll taxes and we're fine. Everything's all right. And I'm sorry I got on a tangent there,
Well,
but it
no,
just makes me angry, and I've been sitting on this for a while.
But you're absolutely right. And the reason why they won't do it is because right now, everybody pays the same payroll tax. If you suddenly took that cap off, the people who have enough money to go around starting things like a power slap league, and yes, that does exist, they wouldn't have as much money to do that with.
These are the people who don't need Social Security.
Right.
And they don't have to pay into it.
Maybe, but not Social Security.
So that was one of the big moments, I think, of last night that I thought was really interesting. You know, you have Biden who kind of laid a little bit of a trap for them, and they walked right into it on Social Security, which I thought was fantastic. And I knew you were going to lose that bet, and I knew it was going to be Marjorie Taylor Greene who was going to cost me that bet. Who was
Which
dressed like
I only put $5 on it, because if I put more than $5, then it might start to hurt a little bit.
And I thought she was dressed like she had 100 Dalmatians back in her office that she was holding prisoner. So anyway, so what else stood out from last night's State of the Union, Denise?
Well, another thing that kind of stood out to me was the fact that, you know, Joe Biden basically, you know, on the one hand, he said, look, we got to work together. The American people said we got to work together. We can do this if we put our minds to it. But on the other hand, he also let them know, if you come up here with laws banning abortion, laws getting rid of Medicaid and Medicare, laws that, you know, continue to mess with voting rights or any of these things, if you come up with any of that, it's getting vetoed. In fact, he said something along the lines of, you know, in the words of my old college coach, you know, good luck in your senior year, or something to that effect, you know, basically letting them know, okay, you can send all of this stuff to me, but it's not going to get anywhere. And what people don't realize is that even though the House of Representatives is probably going to send some absolute craziness over to the Senate is still under Democratic control. And Chuck Schumer has pretty much said, I'm not even putting it on the calendar. So you can send over those articles of impeachment against Joe Biden. They're going nowhere. You know, you guys have fun. But another thing that also stood out to me was, you know, Kevin McCarthy when he became Speaker of the House, it took 15 votes, and there was even like fisticuffs getting ready to get engaged. The vote before the vote that actually made him Speaker. What you saw last night was the definition of Pyrrhic victory. This man is the Speaker of the House, but yet he has absolutely no control over his caucus. He was trying to tell folks to behave themselves, don't shout things out, don't otherwise act silly. And it fell on deaf ears, which is, why when he went after the second or third vote, when he was running for Speaker of the House, I just kind of looked at it and said, why are you putting yourself through this? Because even if you win, you lose. And you saw that last night.
Yeah. First of all, I don't know the political aspect of it, right? If you don't have the votes and you don't have the votes, you should step aside.
Right.
Otherwise, what happened is what we saw, the sheer utter embarrassment he had to go through, that he just accepted, and the capitulation he had to make in order to get those votes, which left him largely powerless, in my opinion. Certainly hijacked by the far right of his party. He kind of sold it all just to get that position, and he's not going to be able to utilize it the way other speakers have.
Right.
And I agree with you. You saw it last night. He cannot control that right wing of his caucus, which has grown larger over the course of the last few years.
He is learning the lesson that John Boehner learned the hard way. You can't control. These are the people that Ronald Reagan only let out to vote. So why did you think that when they took over, you'd be able to do anything to handle them? You can't, because these folks have come in on extreme agendas that I would be willing to bet that most of the people in their own legislative districts don't want. But because of how these legislative districts have been gerrymandered, they'll be able to come back every year, whether it makes sense or not.
I always think back to the story from the 80s, I believe. Barry Goldwater was the Republican nominee for president in 1964. And he was about as far right for the 60s as you could get. In the 80s, he was still in the Senate. And one of the last interviews he gave, he said, I can't believe it, but I'm one of the liberals in my party now. I'm a moderate Republican compared to some of these other people. And I think, and that's the 80s, and now over the last 30 years plus, it's gotten to a place where the right of the Republican Party is so far right. It's actually pulling the entire party that way. So it's one of those things we're going to continue to talk about, this extremism that we're seeing. And some people will say, well, the left is doing it too. I don't think so. I don't think it's the left has its own issues, but it's not as serious as this. So we've only got about a minute left. So Denise, last word on State of the Union.
Well, basically, you've seen what you're going to be seeing for the next 2 years from Congress, which is not a whole lot, because they're going to give the president stuff he's not going to sign. And, basically you're going to see, I would bet that maybe Kevin McCarthy has another 6 months as Speaker before the vote of no confidence comes. And it is probably on the way.
Right. Next week on the program, we will be joined by City Commissioner Omar Sabir. Thank you all so much for being with us. And we'll see you next week on Hall Monitor.